And I think, sometimes I start thinking about things that are happening in our world around, and I think that a lot of this comes from that. And I'm going to start with, they just recently revealed the Martin Luther King statue in Boston. The statue, as I understand, is called Embrace. It cost $10 million. But people viewing it, and we're going to get to this towards the end, but viewed that it might have a pornographic nature, and I'm going to just leave it at that. We'll get to that in a little bit. MLK, though, we had Martin Luther King Day at work, and at noon, it was wonderful because they had different staff, some of which we knew, some from the entire system. So they were all the way from Dallas all the way across. And they were reading portions of the I Have a Dream speech. And it was interesting because you could just see the comments just lighting up. And then you're seeing, I know them, and so I didn't know who was going to be doing it. And very early, there was one of our chaplains, and I sent her an email, and then I went, wait a minute, there's somebody else, and it was really wonderful. I'm glad they did it, and it was awesome. But anyway, and so, his name he was Michael King Jr., but his father, who was a Baptist minister, fell in love with the ideas and the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther King in Germany, and so he changed his name, but he also changed his son's name. So that's how he became Martin Luther King Jr. As I said, he was a Baptist minister, and in process of this, I went through the speech, and I was going to use it as my sermon, and that was like Tuesday or Wednesday. But then I discovered along the way that actually a lot of this material is copyrighted. And there are fees involved with that. And I didn't know if it would apply or not. And so I called the office in Atlanta, and then they referred me to Eric Tidwell, who also in my email asked if he was related to our world famous Ira Tidwell, Sr. and Jr. And he never responded to that, but he did say, thank you for contacting us and for seeking to include Dr. King in your project. Our licensing process is very straightforward. I have attached our standard permissions request application. It should provide all the requisite information we would need to review and consider your request. The form is universal and not all sections will apply to you. Please complete those that do in their entirety. Include all of page 1, sign and return the form. If available, please also include a detailed narrative which will help us fully understand your project. If your request is approved, we would grant the requested rights through execution of a long form license agreement. Please don't hesitate to contact with me any questions as you complete the form. We look forward to reviewing your request. Well, obviously, didn't have time to get all that done, and then I didn't know what was going to happen with the whole thing, so I can't use the speech, so I'll just tell you that. And I also don't want to get in trouble, and I don't want the church in trouble, so we're not going to do that. I'm going to basically, there will be veiled references about the speech, but I do highly recommend you read it. But in the speech, one of the things that he talks about was the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And I think that I have a take on that because I am Baptist, but I want to take you to that and talk about some things because the first thing, if you read the Declaration of Independence, it actually talks about the harms and the things that England were doing. But it says, when in the course of human events, in other words, they're just saying at this point in our time, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which has connected them with another. They're saying that we want to declare independence. But he said that, and assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So in other words, they're saying, we're not just going to separate and say, well, we don't like you. We're going to give you the reasons why that we're separating. And so the whole Declaration of Independence is about that. But I think the other thing in there is there's an idea that we're going to get into in a minute in the next part about where does our power come from? Where does government come from? But I also want to say it's interesting that he references this and the Constitution. I think there's a lot to that and a lot of history that relates to Baptists of why that those documents are important and how that they set the tone for our country. The other one thing that I've had a thought about is I don't know how many people, as I get older, I'm not really into blaming everybody for everything that happened, but yet I don't know if you've ever heard, but you could blame Christopher Columbus for both of our national wars. And everybody's going to go, what? Well, the first thing that happened that to get to the American Revolution, Columbus apparently, and I'm not remembering, at one point I knew, but in some of his travels to the Americas, he brought potatoes to Europe from some of the southern areas, maybe the islands or something. But it took potatoes to England. Well, England, at the time, they started growing potatoes. It was a good food crop. Well, remember, they had the potato famine, and the potato famine made the Irish, who live on an island right next to England, but they're all part of the British Commonwealth. The Irish then, at that point, didn't trust their government. But also, because of the potato famine, it caused a lot of people to immigrate from England to the United States, to the Americas. Interestingly enough, they settled in places like Boston, where we're talking about this statue, places, that's where they get the Bolton Celtics, you know, there's still this Irish influence. St. Patrick's Day is actually coming up, so we could even throw that out there. But they also lived in places like Lexington and Concord. And so you could see that that might be a site of foment whenever they said, well, this is what the British government's doing to us over here. And maybe we've had enough. You know, not only did we run from them from the potato famine, but they're doing this stuff now, and maybe we've had enough. And so the first fight, you know, the shot heard around the world was fired in Lexington. Is that a small deal? Well, you know, it does somehow relate back to the potatoes. The other thing that Columbus did, though, that if we want to blame him, but there's a lot to think that goes to this, is that he brought corn back, and corn was a food that could be dried, you know, basically grown and dried. It's my understanding, I guess you can pull corn right off the stalks dried if you let it go long enough, but it's a food source. But that was a food source that enabled the slave trade, because potatoes would rot. You can't put them and feed people. And I say, slaves, horrible. It's what they're doing. But they could use the corn to feed them, and that's how that the slave trade started in England, which is actually how we got the slave trade in the United States. So everybody's mad about the slave trade in America. We got to go back to our roots, and it's just ugly. And I said, I can't get on all that, but, you know. But in this thing, it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, which means the truths that we're about to talk about, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, that to secure these rights, government is instituted among men, should be people, whatever, you know, language, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So in other words, they set up to make this new country not governed by a king, but governed by people, which is a different deal. And they also say, where do we get our rights? We get our rights from God. Because deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, in other words, if they become damaging to the people, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. In other words, they're saying, we are doing this revolution not lightly. We're not doing it just because we didn't like what the king wore or said or whatever. We got some serious problems. And then they go in to relate some of that, and one of the first things they talk about is representation. Laws were being passed and things were being done that they had no input. And let's face it, you know, one of the things even in the United States that we try to do is give the individual states a lot of power over some laws, because things are not the same in respect to other states. We can assume that, but let's face it, you know, we're not coastal. Let's say that Maine wants to make some rule about their waters and their coast. I guess Texas does have coast, but let's say that you're a center, let's say that you're Montana. You know, the laws would be different, and the laws may have a totally different meaning and a good reason for it. And so if you say can't do certain things in waters, well then you're saying the same thing if it was nationwide. Then Montana might have problems with, this is what we do in our waters, and this is why we do it, and it's different. I hope that works, but we actually have some issues like that. And so that's one of the things that they're talking about is, we are way over here, y'all are way over there, and you're doing all this stuff to us, and we don't get a vote, and it's not right for us. They said that he appointed judges dependent on his will alone. In other words, the king could send somebody, and the judge pretty much had absolute power. And they also say he has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. What they're saying is that the food that they are working to produce and grow and everything else, they're being taxed, and this person is living high and mighty. And to give you an example of that, I've been to Colonial Williamsburg, and in fact, we were talking about that just last night, in Williamsburg, Virginia, and if you get to the governor's palace, it's incredible. But they also talk about the types of parties they had at the governor's palace, that many of these big estates, they would have parties that lasted all night long, and you spent like you crashed there, and it was normal. You brought your luggage and you stayed overnight, and so there's some of that. But they're talking about for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. They put troops in people's homes. In other words, so that's one of the things that we have a prohibition about, is you can't put soldiers in a private person's homes. But they did that. They imposed taxes on us without our consent. They deprived us, in many cases, the benefits of trial by jury. In other words, you wouldn't even get your say, and somebody could say, no, you're guilty, you're innocent, and just do it. And that was very wrong. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coast, burned our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. And they are even talking about getting into some of this. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, dissolution, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. He has taken, this is another one interesting, is that some Americans don't realize this, but during this time, if you were a sailor and your ship got captured, you were conscripted to work for whatever that country was. And so he has constrained our fellow citizens, take captive on the high seas, to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. So it says, this is not something that we just did. We've petitioned for redress. We've gone to them and said, these are our problems, and he's still a tyrant. And at the end, they kind of get to that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they're absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain ought to be totally dissolved. Okay, so I think that is kind of a background that we're dealing with. We still deal with that. You can all argue about, well, things were not the way that we would want them then, but I think things weren't the way even that some of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, that it's not the way that they wanted it either. I mean, you can say there's not a perfect world. They knew that, but I think that their hearts were in the right place when they wrote this. I think they meant it. I think they actually meant it. If you look at, like, Jefferson freed his slaves upon his deathbed, I think some of these people really did. I mean, we can't say all of them. We don't know who. But I think many of them were in the right place with what they had planned, and it's going to be a thing of future. And so we're still in that too. I just want to throw that out there. But in his speech, he talks about freedom and equality, which is a constitutional idea. It's all in here, and I think that's very important. And then the other things that he talks about, deeds, let's be nonviolent with our protests. We had over 500 protests, a couple of years, was it last year before, all over. And I don't think that Martin Luther King would agree to that behavior. I think that would be against what he would be saying. But even things with deeds and with ideas and everything, at some point you've got to get to the point where you get over some stuff. And I don't know what that is, but I think it's interesting because I love the quote by Morgan Freeman that I found. And he says, I'm going to stop calling you a white man, and I'm going to ask you to stop calling me a black man. And I think that is right at the heart of what we really need to get to, is singling out for whatever reason, and just face people that are people. And the other thing that he talks about is distrust in like the next paragraph, but distrust, whether he says, do not have distrust against whites as a class, because many of them are here, many of them are a part of our movement, But I think one of the things about just even the word distrust, looking at our world today, Something changed with 9/11. Obviously, a lot of things changed, but something big changed, and I think it was visual and palpable, and in respect to our government. I had been to, I mean, I was a kid, teenager maybe 12, 13. I had been to the Capitol of the United States. At that time, we walked up the steps and we went inside the building, and we got to walk around and look at the statues and everything else. We, could go in, Well, to go to the United States Capitol now, because we did it 20, 30 years later with our kids, with my son Rory and Abby, my daughter, we went to our congressman's. You had to have an appointment. We went to our congressman's. We left all of our belongings. They took us to the congressional train. We went underneath to the Capitol. They bring us up. One of their aides was our tour guide the whole time. We got to see the Capitol. And it's interesting because I could have given a better tour than the aide, because there's some really cool things in that place you didn't talk about. Like one of those rooms, just to give you an example, one of those rooms, there's a distance from about this piano to the back door across this room, and it's a big open area. And they said that they learned, because it's a dome, that if somebody was over here speaking, even in hushed tones and talking, that people over there could hear it because the acoustics sent it. So somebody figured that out early, and they'd put the opponents over here, and that way they had inside information. Isn't that scary? But spying even within our own government. But they did. But there's that sort of stuff. So we left the Capitol, and we're out now after getting our stuff back, and we're back on the streets. And I had a weird thought. I said, do our kids really know where we just went? Because we didn't went up the stairs. We went, underneath. And so I asked them. And so my son goes, we just went over there to the Capitol. And my daughter goes, She did not realize that was where we were, because we went. I said, oh. So after 9/11, our politicians have become isolated in so many ways. They just even the offices, even our government buildings, there are obstructions. And I think that has even gotten worse with COVID. And so one of the problems with isolation can be distrust. We can't reach these people. We can't talk to them. And that's a difficult problem. The other thing, just even on distrust and deeds, one of the other things that I saw in looking at the statue and trying to look at images, one of the fascinating, it's just funny how people pull everything apart. There's a picture, I was like, what is this picture? There's a picture of the new MLK statue, and they have what they call homeless studs that are at the base of this thing, and they're little spikes that stick up. So I guess if you tried to lay down there, then the spikes would make it uncomfortable so you wouldn't stay there, basically. But they're called homeless studs. And I thought, yeah, MLK wouldn't like that at all. If somebody needs to lay down and get in the shade or whatever, he would not like that. And yet they're doing it because that's the way Boston and our cities are, and they're trying to, and I'm like, but yes, so that's another thing that I've seen, is that there are these metal studs that are around this thing so you can't sit down, lay down, lean up against it, whatever. He next talks about police brutality, all that sort of thing, which we're definitely living with in our world today. He was jailed 29 times. And I thought that was pretty fascinating. And so he has been there. He, totally understood it. But we try, and I know that some in the audience are former law enforcement, we try to do things so that way we can, A, protect our officers, but also protect individuals. And one of the things that we have started doing is body cams. We put a body cam on somebody so that we can try to see what is going on. The problem, sometimes body cams aren't on, and sometimes they don't work. They're technology. They could be turned off, but they also are supposed to be on. In fact, they have punishments if they're not on and they do certain things. And so all of that's going in there. But with the body cams, I think good and bad. Obviously, like I said, we talked about all this. There's a lot of good and bad both ways. But one of the things that it does is that it shows what's going on. Sometimes we have video too. Sometimes we don't, I guess. I don't know. But I think the same thing that's odd about that is now if you see an image, you're going to interpret that image. And how often in our media do they do what we call sound bites? They've taken this entire speech, could be totally against something else, but then they take one part out, they dissect that out, they use that and whatever. And so you could take a section and it looks really one way or another just by that section, but without the whole context. But I think the other thing that it's done is if we're showing the body cams, it tends to take all Americans and turn us into the space of jurors, and so we are making up our own decisions based on what we have been given access to, and we run off with that. And so I think that there's use, and I think there's not. But I think the other thing that I have to keep coming back to, for me, I try not to be quick to jump to judgments every time, because as I like to say, I wasn't there, I wasn't in their shoes, I don't know what was going on, I can't judge that. The other thing, and I'll tell you that I've learned a lot, and I was talking to my wife, we got to yesterday drive a little bit, and she has been on grand jury, which is a commitment because she's on there for months, and you meet every week or something, and you go through all these cases for the county, and you decide, does this meet something that goes to trial or not, et cetera, et cetera. And she said it's amazing the way that something is portrayed in the paper versus what really happened. And you're like, whoa. So we need to leave things to juries, and maybe not, but at the same time, you don't understand. I mean, you're kind of like, I still have no idea. I have not watched the Memphis stuff yet. I will. I have not watched it yet, because I didn't want to watch it before this, because I don't want to, and I'd be picking sides. I don't want to pick sides. I don't want to do that. At that point, trust me, I'll form some opinions later. But the thing is, why release the camera to the public? And I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier: is distrust. People don't distrust our law enforcement, our jury system, our judges, or whatever. Moving forward with that, though, I think that it endows upon us an obligation as Americans to do jury duty. If you get called for a grand jury to serve on that, yes, it's a commitment, but you should do that. I mean, there are, things get drawn or whatever, but if you can do it, I think you should do it. Because that is how that our law is supposed to be set up. Is it's supposed to be a trial of a jury by people that are your peers, not like some judge that we talked about earlier from England who can just make his own decisions and say, oh, well, this is going to look good or bad for Memphis. Let's do it this way or that, And so we need to actually have things exposed and do it. But anyway. Now, the other thing that that is going in here, though, is he's talking about some things about where people live, their cities, their homes, that sort of stuff. And another area that I get a little bit into is about property taxes. Because the older I get, the more I see what's happening with property taxes, and the more that it disturbs me. Because, it's bad enough. I just learned this statistic. If you buy a home for $350,000, by the time you pay off your mortgage, you've paid like $900,000 or something. Somebody did some math, and I didn't do it, but I'm like, wow. Well, along the way, you're also having to pay property taxes on your homes. And I understand there's a good for that property tax, because it does do things like education, where we're going to get taught into. It does provide for services. It does all of those things. The concern that I get into, though, is that over time, especially in our nation, as you get older, we were talking about older people and funerals and stuff. As you get older, you're fixed income. And if things increase in value, you have no way to supplement that income. And so, therefore, you can't pay your taxes. And if you can't pay your taxes, I believe it's 5 years. If you don't pay it for 5 years, the county can put that property up for tax sale and sell it. And I will honestly also tell you, I didn't research this because I just thought about it now, but I didn't think about it before, is that I don't know how it works in Texas, but they were talking about, I was hearing somebody talking about that in some states that the government pockets it, even if they make a profit on the deal. Let's say you only own $15,000, but they got $100,000. Some of these places pocket the difference. Some states, they are required to give you back what's left over. But at the same time, let's face it, that property, it may be of that value, and that value may have gone up because of immigration, other people are buying or whatever. But that value is not what you initially started paying for, not what you budgeted for, not what you have those incomes for. And so it changes. So the thing that bothers me about that is it prevents generational wealth, especially among the poor, especially among the elderly, especially among African Americans, Hispanics, poverty level whites, you name it, it does that. And so that's why that I think that property taxes now, you're going to say, well, what's the answer? I don't have the answer. Obviously, I'm not God, but I think maybe, a sales tax when the property is first purchased should be pretty high. Maybe that's it. I'm not, and do you think that I'm opposed to taxes? I'm opposed to quite a few of them, but not all of them. The ones that tax our addictions, I think I'm okay with that. If it's taxing our smoking, our drinking, or whatever addictions we have, okay. We're making Americans maybe better because we're taxing them. I don't know. If it taxes our needs, like housing and food, I think that's a problem, but for what it's worth. Going back to the things about, he talks about equality, freedoms, and one of the concerns we have right now, one of the things that is disturbing all of us because we don't know how to deal with this, and I don't obviously either, but it has to do with controlling our borders or not controlling those borders. And when I actually traveled as a teenager and we went, in fact, I'll talk about it a little bit, but we went to other places. China, I did China as an adult, but we went to Moscow. It was behind the Iron Curtain. We were there for 3 days. Went to Germany, France, all these places, Denmark. We traveled. And every time we crossed a border, somebody came on our bus, checked our passports, walked through the bus, made sure that no human beings were there, checked underneath that we weren't human trafficking anybody before we could cross the borders. Every single border all across Europe. Well, at this point, this is from the Daily Caller, Ira Melman, January 24th, 2023. We have had, the current numbers is about 5.5 million migrants across the border, 30,000 Venezuelan, Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, all these. They're under presidential parole, and it's supposed to be temporary case by case, but it has kind of been just wide. That means that 360,000 illegal entries are off the books. However, now let's just talk about cost. I'm not talking about the other things that happen with this. For example, as a physician, I know that there are hotbeds in our world of people with tuberculosis, measles. I've got nurses in the crowd shaking their head. There are other illnesses and diseases out there that we're not screening for and not stopping. And I'm not talking about the drugs or the human trafficking. I'm just talking about cost alone because, we talked about property taxes. That's a financial. I'm going to talk about the financial. When they show up here, if they meet this criteria, they get an earned income tax credit. They're resident aliens, but the earned income tax credit is not a tax deduction. In other words, they haven't earned anything, so they have nothing to be taxed. No, but they will get checks. They will actually get an earned income tax because they're pro poverty level. So we will just give them a check. In addition, because they're classified as lawfully present, they get Affordable Care Act access. So in other words, they get free health care. They don't have to have a 5-year waiting period to get on Medicare and Medicaid like our citizens do. So they get automatically on that as well, or CHIPS if they're underage. And they're currently also working on extra legal channels of immigration with websites and that sort of thing. And then just even talking about the court challenges because the states are getting overrun by, and I'm not talking about just Texas, but other states are getting overrun, and the cost, they think that the estimate this guy gets is that because of the court challenges that the states are having to wage against Washington, that it's going to cost $150 billion just in court costs alone. So who pays that? The people in this room. not our lawmakers, the people in this room. We pay those costs. And so, to me, it's like you're discriminating against your own citizens, your own people. You're saying, you don't qualify for this, but these people do. And I just recently heard, and I think it's, there are good things with the open border, but it doesn't mean that the same thing couldn't have still happened. It's just be through a different channel. But there are bad things as well. But even the good things, one of the things that I'd heard lately is that this man was in Afghanistan. He was anti-Taliban, pro-American. His life was in danger. When it collapsed, he got out, and he has worked his way down to South America and worked his way all the way up, and he came through the Mexican border as an Afghanistan person and is now reunited with his family here in the United States. They got out a different way. And you're like, oh, that's great. But then again, what does that do with terrorists and other people that don't like our country? So, not giving you answers, but just saying it's in there. So I talked a little bit about taxation, property taxes, why we pay it, what it goes for. MLK, he quotes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." He tried to enroll in school at age 5. Apparently he's a precocious child, really wanted to learn, loved it, great. Well, the rules were you couldn't be in school until you were 6. And so basically he got sent home until he was 6 and then could come back, but I think it's a testament to his family, to what he saw as important, and that is education. And I think you'll find that of core of a Baptist, they're going to want education. And the key thing for us, it's a religious thing. And yes, the secular world's going to hate me for saying this and whatever. But the number one reason that Baptists want people to learn to read is because they can take a Bible and read it. That they can take that Bible and they can learn the Scripture for themselves, not what somebody else is telling them. We have entire groups of people like the Gideons that give Bibles out. We just want people to read it. We want them to make their own choices, but we want them to be able to read it. And if you want to talk about something that happened in the United States, back to Boston, in the pre-revolutionary period, I think it's pre-revolutionary period, there was a Baptist minister who read the Bible to a blind man, and as a result, he was beaten on Boston Commons in punishment for reading the Bible to a blind man. You say, oh, that would never happen here. We're a country of free people. No, because he wasn't a member of the Commonwealth Church. He was a Baptist. And the other thing about Baptists is a lot of them settled in like Rhode Island and some of those not high slave places too. So, but anyway, we have had that happen. So don't let anybody tell you that it didn't happen. I can prove it to you. But we want reading. We want people to learn. We want education. We want our schools to be taking children so that they can function in this world. One of the interesting things I ran into when I lived in Pennsylvania is there's the Amish community. And the teachers there feel a higher burden for Amish children in many ways than the other kids, because an Amish child is only able to go through the 8th grade. They don't go to high school. And so those teachers are like, I'm going to give this person all the skills they need to work in this world by 8th grade. And if you think about math, you're like, whoa, how much, they need math. How much reading, how much. And so it puts a little bit of a burden on their shoulders. And if all of our teachers kind of had that burden for all children, oh my gosh. But then along the way, we have unions, and we have teachers' unions, and we have older teachers, and they're afraid of the virus. And I get all that. I get it. I've been there. I get it. But at the same time, should we be able to have government employees form unions? That's kind of interesting because, tax dollars are paying for their salaries, and yet we are allowing them to dictate how much they make and everything else, which that should be up to our legislative bodies and everything, not to them to be able to, like the air traffic controller strike, or, we can go through history and do other things. But anyway, I think that we do, that's what taxes are collected for, and I agree with that 100%. We need to educate our children. We need to make sure that they can read and write, understand computers, science, there's things that they need. There's a lot of stuff they're teaching schools that we don't need. I got in a debate with a friend at work about, reviewing library books. And I think that the main thing for me it comes back to is what's age appropriate. And in many ways, when I say that, there are concepts that I think that preteens shouldn't get. Their teens are going to get. I mean, trust me, the girls in my school passed around their romance novels, and they weren't in the library. It's going to happen. But at the same time, the school maybe needs to be in that. And one of the examples I also want to use, you have to understand my grandmother was not a warm and fuzzy grandmother. I think she got married at like 14, and so she kind of had a tough road. But she could read, she could write. I knew all this. I mean, there was not like she couldn't do this. But she just wasn't the kind of grandmother, here, sit in my lap, we're going to read a book. I knew that, just not her. And so an accident, something had happened, and so I was with her for a week or something, staying at her house, and it was only a couple blocks from school. It was wonderful because I could just walk to school and walk back. They didn't have people abducting children walking to school. And so I walked to school. But during that time, we got to go to the library, and I picked up Cat in the Hat, and I was like a first, second grader. And I thought, oh, this is going to be awesome. I'm going to take this book home and read it. It's a beautiful book, And I got home, and I got so frustrated because I couldn't understand it. I could read Go Dog, Go, See Cat, whatever. The language in Cat in the Hat was here. It was kind of like MLK at 5 showing up with some of these 6-year-olds. He may have made it, and he may not have. But the thing is, it can also be frustrating if kids are not in the rights, and I get it. But it's a good thing I didn't just totally shut down, because I could have said, I give this up. But that is where that we really need to make sure that people are helping and supervising our kids so that they get age-appropriate things that they can read, in addition to the smut and all the other stuff. I think there still is a role for that. And we were even talking about, I said, I don't really know how it really worked in our school, but I do know that the librarian had a pretty good role in what was going on. I mean, she would ask you, if you're in the wrong section, say, oh, well, you need to be over here. That particular day, I got the Cat in the Hat, and obviously I wasn't in the right area. And I don't know if that was even our regular library. That may have been we may have had an elementary library and a high school library. I don't know, but I know that she had an influence on what people could get into what sections. She made sure that you were able to kind of at least read, and is this something that's age appropriate for you? I don't know. And so there is a role for that. I just don't know what that is, And the problem is that also, even we were talking about it, the problem is, even as parents, how do parents know what their kids are getting at school? Because do you get a text notification every time a kid checks out a book in the library? My mother was a teacher, and I knew that if I got in trouble, I may have gotten busted at school, but I was going to get busted at home, and I knew it. And somewhere in that middle school area, I wrote some poetry that I probably shouldn't have, that got caught in passing. And so I ended up in the principal's office, and they did know that if you took a trash can and you lean over an empty trash can and you take your licks, that the force gets transmitted through that trash can, and it goes boom. They were smart, trust me. The superintendent principals knew this. So I took my licks, went back to class. I never told my mother. And she never found out, as far as I know. Because I know I'd been in trouble if she found out. I just didn't mention it. Now, I was willing to fess up if she caught me. But see what I'm saying is, kids could have access, and we would never know what they're getting, because how many kids even have somebody else forge their signatures or whatever? That's where you need parents involved in their kids and in classes, and so you can call them up and not have confrontations with them, which is also bad. Some parents have a chip. My daughter's a teacher. Some parents have chips on their shoulders, and it's, you're like, even with the word go, it's bad. You don't want that. You need this alliance so that they are agreeing. And if there's educational stuff that could be done after school that the mainstream may not want, I'm fine with that, but parents need to be present and have it. And I don't know how you do all that. I'm not saying I give you answers, but I think that's something that I think MLK for education, for reading, he's all in, and that's why. He says that his 4 little children will be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. One of the things that we also have to kind of deal with that at some point we got to get to is judge not lest you be judged. Forgive 7 times 70, and the standard by which you judge, you will also be judged, which is also a little bit of an interesting deal. And towards the end, like I said, I can't go through, can't read it. But my country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty. Of thee I sing, land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside let freedom ring. And so I think we are, you know, we're at a crossroads all the time. We're an evolving country. We need to keep evolving. We need to keep doing that. Now back to the statue. The National Endowment of the Arts in 2019, no, I think these were maybe the data for 2016, I'm not sure, but somewhere in there. It's pretty recent. There were 152.85 million US dollars spent on the National Endowment of the Arts. And you're going to hear people say, well, you know, they need the money. Well, the problem that I also see is how much of the stuff that they're doing that could be, some of it's art and some of it's not. And it's like Thurman Marshall said, you know, I know pornography when I see it, you know. And so we're funding stuff that a lot of Americans don't agree with. But some of the art is blatantly obscene, okay. And then you're saying, well, should we have funding like that or not? Well, I think the answer to that, to me, goes, are we taking care of our citizens first? If we're doing that, then we can deal with the art. Then we can start putting money that way. But if we're not, you know, if we've got homeless people, we've got mental illness, can you imagine what $152 million would do for mental illness in this country right now? And I think, and back to, I haven't seen the video, and I intentionally avoided this one too, but I got to hear the audio of the Paul Pelosi attack. It sounds like that guy was crazy. I mean, mental illness. I mean, straightforward, guy's got a hammer, mental illness, done, you know. Maybe we could have done something with that. I don't know. But should the funding be cut? Well, everybody, they're going to say, well, if you cut the funding, we're not going to have any art. This is going to be a judgment on Americans. American households average $2.3 thousand per year for entertainment. Is that movies? Is it books? Is it Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, YouTube, on and on and on? Carl, I'm going to hit a little closer. Is it football tickets? Is it symphony ticket? You know. But you get what I'm saying, you know, that we spend a lot of money, so it's out there. So they can't say we don't have any funding. If American people like it, we'll pay for it. In 2016, which pre-COVID, I understand that, but the box office has brought in $11 billion.
Basically, they would advertise on the TV first.
Yep.
Tell you the dates is going
have
to
the
be
trailer,
at the movie.
so they
correct. And then they would. I mean, everybody was going to movies. That's why you saw these mega movie theaters getting popped up everywhere. Yeah. But now since COVID,
our habits have changed. You know, and the other thing that's fun is I get to tell my residents, because you know they weren't even born when Star Wars came out. I can say I got to see Star Wars in the theater. I had an 8-track player in my car, you know, or whatever, you know, and so we're even kind of into that. But yes, it's incredible the things, but we've shifted as a society, and even in this Oscar environment, you know, they're doing what has been streamed too. It's not, you know, you're up for awards for stuff that didn't make it there because they're marketing and how they market it. Which I want to also throw another Morgan Freeman quote out. Like I said, I tell you, to me, my favorite movie with him in it is Robin Hood with Kevin Costner. He is just excellent in so many ways. He delivers this baby with a surgical procedure. We don't know what he does. He does. It's incredible. He is, you know. But anyway, they asked Morgan Freeman which movie should he have gotten an Oscar for. He said all of them. I agree. I think he should. But, you know, that's another thing. We don't pick. We're not, you know. But anyway, Thomas Jefferson had said, if you have a government that can give me everything I need, they can take away all I have. I think COVID started seeing encroachments of governments on us and all kinds of stuff in all kinds of ways, whatever. back to the MLK statue, because, like I said, I've been reflecting on it and thinking about who I think MLK was, the statue, et cetera, the whole thing. The artist's plan. The artist's plan, he took a photo of Martin Luther King and Loretta in a hug, and he used that as the way that he decided to make the art. The art was called Embrace. It has no faces, no heads. When I told you I've been in Russia and I've been in China. I've seen Lenin at Lenin's tomb. I've seen Mao in what we call the Mausoleum. I've seen Mao. I've seen Lenin. Their statues and images are everywhere in those cities. I mean, you can't turn around without seeing. We as American children started naming Lenin Old Ugly. There's Old Ugly again, because he was all over the place. You can't, like they can't swing a cat without hitting whatever. You know, they're all over the place, and so those statues are there. Now, one of the things that I started thinking about, if you were MLK, would you want a statue with your face on it and your picture on it? And going back to the religious background, you know, there's this thing about graven images, and I certainly don't fully understand what God fully really means by that, but you're not supposed to have graven images. But the problem I get into is that when we start putting statues up with people's faces and that sort of stuff, they kind of become graven images because it's hero worship. And yes, they may be politicians or whatever, but do we even need statues with faces whatsoever? I don't know. It's just a question for you. Is that a graven image? That's a question for you. I'm not trying to answer it, but I kind of wonder, how would he respond if it has his face on it? He might say, no, I don't want a picture of the created. Get the creator, and we don't know what the creator looks like, so you're stuck. But, and I'm not really fully trying to defend the artist anyway, but I don't think the artist intended for that to be viewed pornographically. I've tried to look at it multiple ways, and I think I might have figured it out, but I haven't seen the thing personally because it's in Boston. But back to the thing. Embrace has no face, no head. But if you look at it, it really does have hands and arms, and they're interlocked. And I also want to say back to another thing about this, and the pastor and I were talking about this, not throwing you under the bus, just that that let's be honest. Martin Luther King is one of the best preachers, not speech writers, no, preachers of our lifetime. His sermons are copyrighted. His sermons, people can quote portions of. Maybe he didn't write them all, whatever, but he did sermons. They're not speeches. You know, this is not, you know, I want to call it the We Have a Dream speech, because that's where we should be. We should have this dream. The We Have a Dream speech is a sermon. I mean, you know, you could just read it. It's a sermon. It's very appropriate for all, you know, I can't say all of them. I haven't been able to read all of them, but, you know, it is. So he's one of the greatest preachers of our times. But back to the statue, I think that if he was alive and looking at this, that he would analyze it and he would look at it and say, embrace. You know, you're onto something there. Because there's a statue that we don't know who's hugging who and what's going on, but they're interlocked, two different people interlocked. And if we are going to fix racism in this country in our time, in our lifetime, that is where it starts. We have to embrace each other. We have to embrace the things that make us different, whether it's, you know, you eat peppers that I don't, fine. Doesn't mean that I should like you or dislike you. You just have a different preference. You eat this, I don't eat that. You wear this, I don't wear that. You do this, I don't do that. As long as it's not something that's blatantly religious against my God, and I'm not being against your God, which also the Baptists, the freedom from, freedom of, and freedom for, there's a whole, you've heard me speak about that with Madison and this Baptist preacher. Those things are in there because as Americans, we need to embrace that people are going to be different from different places, etc. And we need to embrace that. Yes, there are people coming across borders that we have to embrace. They're different. But the whole process, we've got to figure out, and we've got to do something about it. I don't know how to do that, but something needs to be done because the way it's being done now is not good for anybody. I don't think. And, you know, but anyway, But back to the statue, I think that he'd say, yeah, good statue, like it. And so, somebody can come up that has no, I mean, let's face it, if you try to look at that statue having no idea who it is about, what it is, you're going to get the right message, I think. But at the same time, people see things, and I get it. We all bring our own biases and our own images and everything else. But so at the end, I think that that author is onto something, the artist, and I think that we need to embrace, and that's where it goes.
I agree. And I think if we start embracing, like you said, our differences, embracing things, looking at things just as they are. And sometimes that's
Not necessarily judging, just
right, just,
I was thinking about this the other day. Somebody does something. I've gotten over it, and I'm like, why'd you do that?
hmm
Ask a kid, not, oh, look at the beautiful horse, but what is that?
right. And just look at things just as they are, embrace it as it is, and then come up with the solution to fix it. And I mean, I know it sounds simple to say, but it could be just as simple as that. We have these concerns, but how do we work together to fix it? How do we fix it? And so, and we fix it. Everybody, how do we fix? We all come together and fix it. And so I do agree that, if Martin Luther King could see it, I don't think he would want his face there either. I think he want us to look past him or the person and embrace the concept of what he was trying to say. And so I agree. I really think that the artist is on to something. And if we could just embrace what's happening and look at it realistically and try to fix, I think we can go a little further than where we are, as a country. The good, the bad, the ugly, just whatever it is, it is what it is. Let's see how we can fix it.